All right, welcome to the next topic. Here we go. We're going to start covering defining and measuring behavior and how we do all this fun stuff and how we can actually include it into an FBA and things like that. So this will be a little bit of a longer lecture because I'm really going to combine two lectures together into one here. So a bit of it is review from your research methods courses that you've had in the past, but I'll go over some of this stuff in some depth so we can get some background on the material, if you will. All right, here we go. All right, behavioral assessment in general. Right off the bat, we know there's a whole bunch of methods to make this stuff happen. But primarily speaking, we're looking for behaviors, remember actions, to actually change. We're not going to be focusing on words, right? As we talked about in the past, that one of the problems with one of the differences between ABA and some of the other intervention techniques is that we don't really give two hoots about what you say about your behavior. We give two hoots about what you do. So we will focus on changing your behavior, your actions, right? So as a result, we're going to look for particular behaviors to change, ones that we can increase, ones that we can decrease, and so on and so forth. Okay? We're going to need access we're going to need to assess other resources, right? So we're going to need to assess what's going on in your environment, all sorts of things. Right? So individuals that are available to help you with the intervention. Basically, we're just looking at the big picture here, right? Unlike testing and unlike other types of psychological interventions and measurement stuff, this is not a score. We are not going to put you in a category based on a score. We're not going to say you're one standard deviation above the mean, two standard. That's irrelevant here. And in fact, it's antithetical to the idea of behavior analysis. So when we think about the psychological testing that many of you are very familiar with, behavior analysts just cringe, right? Because we don't buy into a lot of that stuff. And there's reasons why we don't buy into it, and we can talk about that at a later date, or feel free to post questions about it. But ultimately, what we're after is, what is the function of the behavior? What does this behavior get the individual? Now, get sounds like it's going to get them $1 or $20 or whatever. It can be anything. It can be access to, attention. And then some people talk about negative attention and positive attention. I don't talk about either one of those things. Attention is attention. Inappropriate behavior can get you attention. And oftentimes it gets you more attention than appropriate behavior does. So that's something that we got to focus on in terms of functions. Right? And then let's see what else. So that's what we're really going to focus on in behavioral assessment. Now there's a lot of different things we're going to do in order to make that happen. So let's take a look at it. And remember, this is the first parts of doing the FBA, is doing a behavioral assessment. And we'll eventually get into the full FBA stuff, but this is kind of the core of it, so that we need to figure out all these particular tasks that we got to go through, essentially. Right? So how do we assess behavior? We got a couple of different approaches, indirect and direct, right? So we're going to look at indirect approaches, which is interviews, right? So we're going to interviews and checklists. So interviews with the client or the person that has the problem behavior, interviews with if you're in a school district, the teacher. If you're not in a school district, maybe the parents or other people that have immediate access to the individual. So we're going to ask them all sorts of things about, why do you think this person's doing this behavior? Under what conditions do they do this behavior? When do they not do this behavior? That's actually a really important one. When does this problem behavior not occur? Because it helps you rule out scenarios that would lead to the behavior actually happening. All right? And checklists. Does this behavior happen today, tomorrow, yesterday, in the presence of, not in the presence of, so on and so forth? Just behavioral checklists. And you guys, and most of you are pretty familiar with some of those behavioral checklists that are out there. However, we do prefer direct assessment. Direct assessment, we can do tests, right? So you guys are familiar with the various psychological tests. We don't use those very often in behavior analysis, but there are some that you can use, right? I see some value to doing some type of testing to give you an idea about maybe a skill set that a student has, or maybe a maximum capacity that the student currently has in terms of their ability to learn a language or something like that. But most accurately, we're going to focus on direct observation. Right? Tests are really indirect. That's in an odd way. They don't really directly test what you're after. Why? Because if you're doing an intelligence test, how do you know you're really assessing intelligence? Why? Because the form says it assesses intelligence. Now, I know that all those things are extremely well psychometrically validated, and that's great. That's awesome. But but I ask one question, and it's how do you separate the concept of intelligence from the concept of motivation? And the answer is really simple. You can't. Right? So in a sense, those tests, the paper and pencil type stuff, is an indirect assessment. So we have to watch out for those, and don't hang too much weight on them. And I know most of you are going to be school psychs, and the part of the problem there is that that field does hang a lot on those tests, and there's valid reasons for that. I'm not saying that you shouldn't test. I'm saying that from a behavioral analytic perspective, we tend to avoid those indirect things. We just look at the behavior, what's happening, what's the context, and that type of stuff. So as I've said before, direct assessment is preferred. Okay? With regard to the interviews, right, we're going to interview the person with the problem. Don't ask them why. they won't know, or they'll come up with some BS, right? So never ask that question, why. Ask what and when questions, right? What happens when you, so if we're interviewing the person with the problem, say, what happens when you are asked to do your math assignment? Or what happens when Billy Bob makes a funny comment to you? Or what happens when Jessica cries, or whatever, right? So you ask those types of questions, and that way you can get the response of, here is what I do. And then that's getting you at that behavior. Again, remember, interviews are indirect, so you got to be a little cautious about what people are saying and whether or not their statements are accurate. But it's something that you should definitely ask. Right? Essentially what we're doing here is looking for possible discriminative stimuli and possible reinforcers. Remember, discriminative stimuli that's the context, that's the environment. So sometimes kids are, or adults for that matter, you ask them to do a task, and then they'll do anything to avoid it, but then you ask them to do a different task and they'll do it right away. So the question is, the question becomes, since the question was the same, having them do a task, what was the context? What was different? Well, maybe one of those questions was about completing a math assignment, or for an adult, maybe one of them was taking out the garbage, and maybe the other one was cleaning the cat litter or doing a reading assignment. So in other words, maybe the kids don't have any problem doing reading assignments, but they do have a problem doing math assignments, or maybe the husband doesn't have a problem cleaning the cat litter, but does have a problem taking the garbage out. You get the idea that sometimes when you ask somebody something to do something, why are they not doing it, or why are they doing it, is also another one. Now, we can't ask the why here, but we're just looking for possible discriminative stimuli to find out when, under what conditions, these particular behaviors are likely to occur. And in reinforcers, we're trying to possibly, and again, this is an early part of this. This is not, you're not going to know the reinforcers at this point, but it might give you an idea of what might be reinforcing something. Like, for example, if I ask the kid to engage in some math work or something like that, and then they freak out, they start being disruptive in the class, and then they get kicked out of the class, well, guess what? That's a pretty obvious reinforcer right there, and it's that escape from the classroom. So escape from the task can be a big reinforcer. So sometimes you can catch these things and get a good idea about what's reinforcing a behavior in a particular context when just by doing these interviews. But again, we're always going to go back to direct observation and see if we were correct. Right? Others, who do we ask? Right? So that's a huge question. And again, it's anybody that has regular contact with the individual that has the problem, or specifically anyone that has contact with the individual in which they're causing the contact in the setting in which they're actually causing the problem. Right? So is this kid doing it at home? Do they do it only around their parents? Well, then maybe you should be talking to the parents, and talking to the sibling is irrelevant because they don't do the problem behavior around the sibling. Or talking to the teacher is a good thing if they have a problem in the classroom, but talking to the principal is pretty much pointless, right? So you got to really be cautious with who you ask and who you interview, because you don't want them to be misleading you in any way. Right? One of the problems with asking other people is that they're usually too vague. Right? They don't know what's going on. They have no idea. They're not trained as behavior analysts, typically speaking, and they're not going to be looking for the things you're looking for in terms of discriminative stimuli and reinforcers and consequences and all that type of stuff. So again, ask when and how questions. When does Billy Bob engage in this behavior? How does he respond to a particular question? Or how does he respond to this particular scenario? That will then get them more directed. It'll get them talking about exactly what happens, and you're asking them to recall their observations. Now, you're not saying that I'd like you to recall your observations about little Joey here, but when you ask questions of what, when, and how questions, then you're going to end up getting at those observations that the person has made in the past. Checklists. In other words, specific lists of behaviors. You know, you've got this list of behaviors that are out there. Did you engage in A, B, C, D, E, F, and G? And then identify when those behaviors should or should not occur. You know, this is a great tool for self-management, by the way. So scales, you can add scales in there to assess possible discriminative stimuli and reinforcers and punishers and things like that. So SRP or SP there, so is a punisher, right? So scales to assess those things. You know, do you have that? Are you engaging in that particular behavior at this particular time? Are you not? You can give it to the individuals themselves to have them fill it out, kind of a self-monitoring thing. I've done some interventions with that, by the way, and it works really well. We had some interventions with regards with a kid that was there was some math stuff, and they were having some trouble with math, so we just had checklists for them and engage in. Did you engage in behavior X, Y, and Z before you started the math? And if you didn't, then go back and re-engage in that. And then we actually reinforced the individual for completing the checklist. And then what that ended up doing was an accurate completion of the checklist was one behavior. The outcome was learning how to do was successful math completion of the homework. So we, for whatever reason, successful completion of the math homework. For whatever reason, we couldn't specifically tie in some reinforcers for the homework. They were already there. There's the natural points in the course, but the teacher wasn't willing to give extra credit, and there was a couple other constraints that were going on. So we made the checklist, made the behavior of completing the checklist, we made that the requirement, and then of course part of the checklist was completing the assignment. So we were able to get some reinforcers along that line. So again, you can give these to individuals, you can give them to related others. Did they do this? Did they not do it? So on and so forth. Standardized tests, norm referencing. All right, right off the bat, these things are way too general. Right, you're not going to learn about the behavior of a kiddo. Just think of an intelligence test. You're not going to learn what's leading them to make a particular or engage in a particular behavior in a course or at a particular time. They're just going to tell you that this person is X, right? And that's all they're going to tell you, right? Some of them are curriculum-based, and some of them are Criterion referenced, and that's awesome. Those are really good ones, right? So because they actually tell you something about behavior. Are they? Was the student able to engage in a particular task? Did they not do it? Did they do it? Did they achieve the level that they were supposed to be at when they were supposed to be there? And that's a good thing, right? So you want to know if they were. I'm trying to think of a good example here. So Criterion reference stuff, I'm thinking about maybe even some direct instruction stuff. So you can go back and you can assess them, and you know that they've achieved this particular skill level. Right? So those are ones we like, even when they are standardized. But a lot of those standardized tests serve no purpose in behavior analysis. Direct observations, the ABCs, right? So we're going to focus on antecedents, behaviors, consequences. This is colloquial terms for the stimulus, response, stimulus stuff, right? So this is the three-term contingency is often described as the ABCs, the antecedents, which come before behavior, and the consequences, which come after the behavior. Right? So when we do direct observations, we're going to do these ABC charts, if you will, and in reality, you're looking for SDs, which is the same thing as an A, and an R, which is the same thing as a B, and an SR or SP, which is the same thing as a C. So the ABC just helps you remember. It makes it easier to talk about, but typically speaking, that's a very colloquial sort of thing, and we don't actually use that term out in the field. We talk about SDs and SRs and that type of stuff. So, all right, temporally sequenced, overall descriptions, real time. So basically what we're doing here is when we start a direct observation, we're looking for everything, right? Everything we possibly can. We're going to give overall descriptions of the behavior. We're going to do this in the real time, right? And we're going to track this stuff. When I talk about temporally sequenced, I mean that you're going to see an SD happen, then a behavior will happen, then a consequence will happen for that, right? So we're going to track those in that order. So I've got some resources that I'll share with you in my course that would allow you to do these sorts of things and make it easier to track this stuff. I actually just use a steno notebook when I do my ABC stuff, and I add an additional line. Basically, it's small, it's easy to carry around. The thing's already split up into 2 columns. I typically need 3 columns to do this, as you might imagine, ABCs. Sometimes you need 4 or 5 columns, depending on what you're trying to track. Sometimes there's time of day and all sorts of stuff. But basically, you're just recording everything as it happens. And part of the issue with doing this is it requires your total attention. You are going to have to focus 100%. You can't be doing anything else ever. No checking your phone, no doing anything else while you're doing this. You can't talk, you can't teach, you can't do anything, which is part of the reason why you can never ask a teacher to do an ABC. Right? So an ABC is one of those parts of an FBA. Okay? So functional behavior analysis, ABC is kind of the main component of that. Add into that the other stuff we've already talked about in this lecture, and now you're starting to get that bigger picture of what an FBA is. Right? Rule of thumb, write absolutely everything down and don't interpret a darn thing. Do not interpret ever. You're just writing down what happens. I'm trying to think of one of the more recent ones I did. I had a kid in the school, again, this was behavior problem and stuff, and the teacher would ask him to do a particular task. And the kid would actually, believe it or not, the kid would actually do the task, and he would do it very quick. And then he would stuff the paper, and he'd stuff his paper, or whatever he was doing, he'd stuff it in the drawer. Then he'd mess around and do other things, and mess with people, right? So I could interpret that as him being inappropriate, or trying to get attention, or being a class clown, or whatever it is, but that's not what was happening. That's an interpretation. What happened was, teacher made requests, student did the work quickly. Now, the teacher never actually had a hard time actually seeing him do the work. Right? He was so quick at it. And I'm not joking here. This was pretty impressive. I mean, I was watching this kid, and I was sitting right behind him. He didn't know I was watching him, but I was sitting right behind him, and I would watch him do his math assignment that would take the class 20 minutes, and he would have it done in a minute and a half, 2 minutes. And I wasn't there to give feedback to him. I wasn't there to correct his behavior. I was doing an ABC. I was doing an FBA, right? So I was figuring out figuring out what might be maintaining some of his problem behaviors. And I was shocked to see that, first off, he was accurate. And second off, when he was done, then he'd just start messing. He would start doing all sorts of stuff, right? He was throwing paper at people. He threw a pen across the room once and hit one kid in the head and all this stuff. So I wasn't interpreting anything. I was just writing it down. So the teacher made requests, so I wrote down did assignment. And then the next thing I wrote down was assignment completed, and which led to another behavior, which was playing with pencil, or a pencil thrown, and then the consequence of the pencil being thrown. Oftentimes the consequence of this kid, that would happen with this kid, is he would get his homework done, or his in-class assignment done, put it in his desk, and start playing, throwing stuff, and being generally disruptive. Well, guess what the teacher would see? The teacher would catch the disruptive stuff. She had no idea that he was done with his homework, or was done with his assignment, because he'd put it away. So she never caught him doing right. She always caught him doing wrong. So he was actually getting reinforced, or he was getting in trouble, but the trouble was functionally an attention issue is what it ended up being. So he would do stuff just to get attention, and part of the intervention that we ended up developing was having her move him closer to her so she could see that he did his work, and then give him a thumbs up or a good job or something like that when he did when he did complete the assignment early, and so she could see it, and she actually gave the proper attention then. And then she also gave the attention when he did something wrong. She would punish him and give him a timeout or something like that. But and we got the behavior under control really quickly. It took about 3 days. That's all it was. But it took like 4 days of observation, and then the intervention was super fast. Just moved him to a different spot of the room. There was some other distractors that were happening in the position where he was at. Separated him from one kid, which seemed to be a problem. Brought him up front. Teacher caught him doing right, and game over. The kid's behavior was under control. And he was a 6th grader, and he'd had problems for 5 grades before that. Everybody said this kid is a terror, he's evil, he's bad. That wasn't the case. Everybody had interpreted all sorts of stuff about his behavior, but that wasn't the case. He was a great student, and he knew his material really well, but he wasn't being pushed, he wasn't being caught doing right. No one gave him additional stuff to do to keep him from doing the inappropriate behavior. When you're thinking about the individual behaviors that are going on, maybe you got a kid that's out of seat a lot, record the duration as well. So not only are we recording the instance of the behavior, we're recording how long that behavior is going on for. Of course, this only works for behavior that is continuous in nature, something that is ongoing, like out of seat behavior, or crying, or talking out of turn, those types of things. We're not actually going to count the number of words. We're going to count a whole bunch of other stuff. So for those continuous behaviors, you want to go ahead and record the duration if at all possible. It gathers some additional information, and oftentimes people are going to come to you, or may come to you and say, hey, this behavior is, this kid's causing a problem, he's always disruptive, he's always out of turn, talking out of turn, and always doing these things. And you start recording the duration, maybe you find out that, oh my gosh, the kid does talk a lot. In fact, he talks so much and I'm trying to be a little bit facetious here, he talked so much that he disrupts the class for a total of 1 minute a day. Okay? Is that a problem then? Maybe, maybe not. Maybe the teacher's just got it out for this kid or something. And stuff like that happens. Like, you would be surprised. So, anyway, gather that duration information if you possibly can. Reactance. This is cool because it can work against you and it can work for you. Right off the bat, reactance is a problem. So when you're doing your observations, basically you don't want the person to know that you're observing them. So you have to kind of watch other things and watch them, which makes it hard because you're having to basically follow one person around but make it look like you're not following them around. So good luck with that one. It can be a challenge. In fact, that most recent kid that I was talking about, I said I was sitting right behind him. He figured out that I was there for some purpose, and he wasn't quite sure what the purpose was. And so he asked us, "Are you watching my behavior?" And that's literally what he said. And I just laughed. I said, no, I'm watching what your teacher's doing. I said, I'm giving her some feedback about how well she's teaching the class. I'm here to study her. And that was enough. That was all he needed, right? And from that point on, because I would face the front, I wouldn't turn around and face him. I would face the front. Then he didn't have a problem with it. And in some of the other rooms, like art or music or something like that, it was easy because I could just sit off in the corner and record what was going on, and I didn't have to sit right next to him. So anyway, but reactance can be a good thing because you can use. Well, I guess I should back up and finish the story about what the bad part was here. Whoa, let me try this again. Here we go. So the bad part of reactance, again, is if they figure out that you're there to observe the problem behavior, maybe they're going to change their behavior accordingly. It can be an intervention in and to itself, and that's where the benefit is you can use self-monitoring and having someone do their own ABC analysis as an intervention, and that's widely accepted as a very powerful intervention tool. And a lot of times, just having somebody track their own behavior changes their behavior. So use that to your advantage if you've got a kid that's at a level of function where they can do it, right? So where they can track themselves. So, and if that's the case, then and you get the behavior under control with just a little bit of self-monitoring, then awesome. You didn't have to do a major intervention. All you had to do is have the kid track how many minutes they spent doing X, and it worked, right? It seems simple, and it is, and a lot of times it works for you. And remember the parsimony thing, right? So when it comes to these interventions, we're also thinking parsimoniously. What's the easiest way that we can select for behavior and change behavior without disrupting the environment too much? The more you have to disrupt the environment, the least likely your intervention is going to be effective. So, all right, social significance. All right, whose behavior is being changed? Who is the person that you want to have the behavior changed? Oftentimes the teacher's going to be wanting to shoot the dog. This kid is inappropriate, blah, 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 right? They're going to go after the kid, go after the kid, go after the kid. Well, maybe it's the other way around. Maybe it's the teacher that needs their behavior changed. Who knows, all right? But so you have to ask that question, whose behavior is being changed, who's supposed to be changed, is that related to the environmental problem overall, and that type of thing. So why is the behavior being changed? Is this an actual problem, or is this just an annoyance? So again, if it's an actual problem, if it's causing harm, or if it's relevant, to change the behavior for various reasons, then go ahead. You can move forward, right? But you must assess all of this stuff. You can't just assume that the teacher is right in saying that little Joey Bob or whoever here is out of line. You're going to have to assess that for yourself. And ultimately, the idea is you want to improve the life experience for all involved. And primarily, you want to improve the life experience for the kid that is being changed. If your intervention is not going to cause an improvement in that individual's life, then guess what? It's unethical to run the intervention. You need to think about improvement of that individual's life, not the person that's having the problem. So if the teacher's having a problem with the kid, but changing the kid's behavior is not going to improve their school experience, don't bother. It's unethical to do so. At that point, you're just manipulating someone and doing some inappropriate things. And sure, you can do it. You can get a behavior to change, but should you is a big question. You have to ask the question, is it actually possible to habilitate them? Can you do it? Because sometimes you can't. Sometimes you have to understand that you're not going to be able to change this person's behavior in this context. Right? What are the long-term reinforcers? Because a lot of times there's inappropriate behaviors are maintained by these huge reinforcers that are out there that are going to stick around for 20, 30 years, and maybe you can't deal with that. And you need to set up long-term reinforcers as well to compete with those other ones. So there's a whole bunch of different ways to look at this, and I could sit here talking for days about it, but the basic idea is that if we want a behavior to maintain, then we're going to have them access the reinforcers for a long period of time. So this becomes a criteria that we're going to talk about later in the quarter about how you set up for success and how you set up for maintenance. And ultimately what's going to happen is that we want the new behavior to come into contact with natural contingencies, natural reinforcers, and those natural reinforcers should automatically maintain the behavior down the road. And that's the way all of us function typically, right? But sometimes it can be challenging to habilitate someone and get them to come into contact with the natural reinforcers, especially if they've got some competing ones that are also natural that are selecting for inappropriate behavior. Typically avoid punishment. I'm not saying that punishment is bad. In fact, punishment is a very powerful technique that should be used. Okay, it should be. It's a good tool. But it's temporary. Punishment is a very short term, I need to get this behavior under control now. And then I'm going to get this behavior under control. I'm going to get it reduced. And then I'm going to put a new behavior in its place. And that's where the problem is with punishment, that people forget to put behavior in its place. You punish a behavior and you got to build another one up. If you want a behavior to go away, then you're going to need to put one in its place, and we'll talk about why here in a little bit. And it's called the behavioral vacuum, and there is no such thing. So we'll go back to that, and we'll talk about it in a minute. But so avoid punishment as a long-term tool for habilitation. It's a great and wonderful short-term tool, right? If used appropriately. Long-term maintenance is going to lead us to relevance. Are we going to be able to maintain this behavior in a long-term setting for long-term? If so, then it becomes relevant. If not, then we have a particular problem. Can we get the behavior fixed in the current environment? Yes. Can we get it fixed in the future environment? No. Oops. Well, maybe you're in trouble then. Maybe it's not possible to habilitate them. So we want to answer yes to both of those. Can we set up the current environment to select for new appropriate behavior, and can we make sure that the future environment is going to do so and or maintain the newly selected behavior that you're after? Right? So those are the types of things you need to be considering. So and a lot of these things are kind of no-brainers, and it's pretty straightforward. And yes, if I teach this person a study skill, that's going to benefit them over the long run. They'll be able to use it for the next 5 years in school, plus they'll be able to use it for college, plus they'll be able to use it for learning credits later on, so on and so forth. So the point is that a lot of this stuff, a lot of the types of behaviors that you'll be fixing in a school are really straightforward, and they are, it is possible to habilitate individuals. And it becomes a different thing when you're working with different populations, maybe not school populations, but maybe even autistic kids or other kids that have developmental disabilities or even other physical disabilities, and you have to worry about whether or not attempting to habilitate this individual will cause more problems than it will solve. And that's about looking at that long-term stuff and looking at the relevance of it. So, but again, it's not too much of a worry for the schools, because most of the types of behaviors you're going to be fixing are stuff that's going to serve them well immediately and over the rest of their school career. Right? So I've talked a couple of times about relevance, right? So it's right off the bat. Is the new behavior that you're asking them to do a prerequisite for other behavior? Right? In other words, if I want you to learn advanced math, I need you to learn basic math. And make the example even better, if I want you to learn how to do behavior analysis techniques, I need to teach you about the basics of behavior, right? So if you're unable to learn about the basics of behavior, then that's going to be a problem. So maybe I should do an intervention on you, right? In other words, you need to come into my office and see me, and I will correct whatever problems you may be having. That's something I do with my exams. I always have my students come in and talk to me if they're having troubles with the exams, because I want you to learn it, especially early on. That way we can build on that at a later date. So prerequisite for other behaviors. Does this one skill lead you to another skill? Right? So that makes it relevant. Access behaviors, the same type of thing. Right? And does this provide access to, does this one skill provide access to other ones? Not just a prerequisite, but open up the door for you to be able to do something else. Right? Again, that makes it relevant. Does fixing this particular behavior increase the support of others? If so, it's relevant. Does it increase proper social interactions? If so, it's relevant. Right? Is it a cusp behavior? This is probably a really big one. Right? This is one that I like to focus on if at all possible. Exposes individuals to new environments. If your intervention will expose individuals for new environments and increases their repertoire, right? So the idea is that if I give you this skill, right? Or if I help teach you this skill, is that going to open up the door, open up the world of a world of options for you? Is it going to get you out there and teach you that there's other things you can do, or open the door for those things? So it's a cusp, it's a behavior on the cusp. Once you learn it, then it opens up the door for a whole bunch of other things, similar to an access behavior, but a little bit bigger, because it's about that new environment thing. And it also talks about increasing repertoire. So that cusp behavior, once I teach it to you, all of a sudden now you can go and you can start to learn other things. My examples tend to fall back to woodworking and building cars and things like that, because cusp behaviors are really relevant in there. Once I teach you how to use a hand plane, for example, and if better yet, we can go a whole different route. Yeah, well, we'll use that one. So once I teach you how to use a hand plane, now you know also you now have access to a whole new world in woodworking, which involves hand plane use and small hand plane use and shoulder plane use and jack plane use and all these different things, right? Because all the procedures are the same. So I taught you this one skill, this class, this response class, which is using a hand plane, and then it opens up the door to other behaviors. And once you know how to use a rabbit plane, guess what? Now you've got a whole new world opened up to you there. So that first basic skill, teaching you how to use a hand plane, then opens up into learning how to use a rabbit plane, which then opens up into doing all sorts of other stuff. So we've increased the repertoire simply by giving you access to one thing, and everything else was a natural contingency, and it built on it, right? Is what being asked age appropriate? It's like, sure, I can teach a 3-year-old to read. You want me to? Sure, not a problem. It'll take a little while, but it's not going to be too much of a problem. Okay? Give me a couple hours a week, I'll do it. The question is it age appropriate? No. How do we really need our 3-year-olds to be able to read? 4 or 5, maybe. Okay, sure, definitely by the time they're 5. But so ask that question: is this age appropriate? Are you asking the kiddo to make dinner for everybody and they're 7? Or if they're having a hard time making dinner and they're 7 years old, they're having a hard time doing something, then maybe you've got the wrong attitude here. Maybe you're looking at it from a wrong perspective, right? So we want adaptive behaviors. That's what we want. Are these behaviors adaptive to the environment? Are they going to give you the skill set that this person needs to survive and function well in the world in which they live, which includes their age, right? All right. There is no such thing as a behavioral vacuum. It doesn't exist. Why? Because when the moment you reduce a behavior, another one's going to fly into its place. Right? So you always have to be ready for what will replace the problem behavior, because you're going to try and get rid of it. And oftentimes when you try to get rid of a behavior, the first tool you're going to use is punishment. Why? Because punishment reduces a behavior. So by definition, punishment is used to reduce those problem behaviors. But once you've reduced the problem behavior, you didn't automatically train something. You didn't train a new response. You didn't train the kiddo what to do. And do not expect that the kiddo will know automatically what to do, or the adult or the dog or whatever, because they won't. What will happen is, what happens is behavioral variation. So the organism, the person, is going to start changing their behavior. And oftentimes they will change their behavior to something else, right, that may actually be a problem behavior. So when you create that hole in their world, where their behavior used to be, right? So the inappropriate behavior is now being punished. The problem is that all the old cues and all those old things are still there that select for that inappropriate behavior. So unless you change those things too, you're going to be having some troubles. So what you need to do is teach an adaptive response. You need to teach them something, a replacement behavior. So punish, that's great, but reinforce a new behavior at the same time. So I don't have any problem with punishment, but you have to remember that you need to use something else in conjunction with it. By itself, it's effective at only reducing behavior, and it's only temporary. The moment you stop the punishment contingency, that behavior is going to slam right back into place. Or if you start your punishment, doing all that stuff, and then teach another response at the same time, now you're replacing the behavior, which is more important than just killing it. Right? Train specificity, train generality. When are we supposed to do this? Where are we supposed to do it? And are we going to do it across the board? Right? So the idea is give this person access to a behavior and teach them a new behavior and teach them when it's okay and when not okay to do it. Kind of a fun slide. Blah, 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 blah. Right? Saying and doing are two different things. Saying is its own behavior. Right? Knowing and doing are two different things. Why? Because knowing is no different than saying. I know what to do. In other words, I can tell you what to do. That's what knowing really means, is I can verbalize what to do. Right? Doing it is something completely different. Verbal behavior is behavior in its own right. And by that I mean that verbal behavior needs to be explained. Verbal behavior, like I'm talking to you now, right, is a skill all in and to itself. Right? Oftentimes our verbal behavior is descriptive of what we do, meaning that our verbal behavior is telling the rest of the world about what we've already done or what we are doing. That does not mean that the verbal behavior is what we're doing. That meaning that if I'm telling you I'm going to study harder, that means nothing to me, other than the fact that you know how to tell me that you're studying harder. Okay? It is descriptive of what people do. Okay, and so I'm using the verbal behavior to describe what I may want to do or may be trying to do, okay? But it is not doing it. Behavior in its own right simply means that verbal behavior needs to be studied and needs to be understood as something separate than the behavior that the person is actually engaging in. Sure, I'll do my homework tonight, but they don't. Or, no, I'm not going to do my homework, but they do. Right? There's all sorts of things that we can focus on here. Right? But the big point being that don't listen to the people's words. Watch their actions. Right? Saying and doing are different things, knowing and doing. That type of thing. This also leads me back to some of those standardized tests. A lot of standardized tests are just about how you answer a question. In other words, it's a verbal response. So a lot of those surveys and tools like that are just asking you about what you think you're doing in this particular scenario, or what you would say about what you're doing in this particular scenario. It's not what you are doing. They're two very, very different things. So keep that in mind as we go forward, because verbal behavior is something worth studying, but it is not worth using it as an indicator of what is going on. You can't replace that empirical component. Outcomes. Outcomes are the result of behaviors. They're not the behaviors themselves. Okay? An outcome, think of losing weight. Right? What are the behaviors that are associated with losing weight? Losing weight is an outcome. You can't do it. It's impossible. Some people go, yes, I can lose weight. That's an action. No, it's not. It's the result of a series of actions that you engage in. It's a result of a series of behaviors, right? So what are the behaviors that are associated with losing weight? Eating healthier, eating fewer calories, exercising, right? All of those things combined will produce weight loss. Right? But the outcome itself is not a behavior. Getting an A is not a behavior. Studying for the exam, taking the exam, passing the exam, well, passing the exam is an outcome, but taking the exam is one, studying is one, attending class, asking questions. Those are all the behaviors that result in getting A's. Right? So, again, outcomes, they're great, and they may be goals and things like that you want to achieve, but always break them down into the smaller behaviors. In other words, we still need to focus on the critical behavior that gets you to the outcome that you want. Right? But we need to focus on the behavior, not just the outcome. Again, you cannot reinforce somebody for losing weight. You can reinforce them. Why? Because weight loss is not a behavior. So by definition, you can't reinforce that. Reinforcement, again, that definition that we've talked about before, requires that you engage in a behavior in order to reinforce that. You cannot reinforce an individual. You reinforce a behavior. You punish a behavior. You don't punish an individual. So it's something important to remember. Reward is something you can do to an individual. I can reward this person, but I can reinforce a behavior. Right? I can never reinforce an individual. It's a logical impossibility. It's not like you shouldn't or anything like that. All right, how do we prioritize behavior? Okay. Number one, is there a danger to the person engaging in the behavior or anybody else? Is the behavior useful? Will it give them some skill set? Is this a chronic issue? Is it something they're doing over and over and over and over again? If so, it's got some priority. Okay? Will a change increase reinforcement for this person in their world? If the answer is yes, then it's probably something good to do. Will it lead to improved functioning, making the changes? Again, obvious here, right? These are the types of stuff we should do. Okay? Will it reduce negative attention? Again, negative attention is attention provided for behavior that's inappropriate, right, in a particular context. Will this produce reinforcement for others? Is success likely? Is this person going to be able to be successful based on their past experience, based on their expertise, and based on the settings? Are you going to be able to pull this off? And last but not least, costs. How much is this going to cost? Maybe in terms of, not just in terms of dollars, but in terms of effort. How much work is it going to take to change this person's behavior? Because maybe it's not something you should engage in. Maybe it's not worth it.
maybe the one kid acting out 5 minutes a week is not a problem. Okay? Ultimately, when you start to dig into all these prioritizing questions. All right, switch gears a little bit here and let's start talking about defining behavior. We tend to, in behavior analysis, prefer a function-based definition. In other words, we're looking for response classes and their effect on the environment, and again, this allows us to increase our chance for lasting success. Meaning that a function-based definition allows us to know what do you get out of this behavior. So if I'm engaging in the out-of-seat behavior, the moment I'm asked to do sustained silent reading, then chances are, chances are that escape is what is maintaining that behavior. That I can get out of a few minutes of reading just by getting up and getting a drink of water or going to the bathroom or something like that. When we focused on those functions, right, rather than just how the behavior looks, then we can also start to target long-term change. We can start looking at what reinforcers are going to select for and maintain this behavior, the problem behavior, and then also the new behavior that you're going to put in its place. What can we put in place to make that successful, make it stay? Okay? So we're always going to focus on the function. Sometimes we do want to focus on defining behavior as well in terms of a topographical approach. In other words, how does behavior look? What does it look like? In general, this is what we've talked about historically in the past with regards to, we call it, operational definitions. So we operationalize it. In other words, how does this behavior look? Oftentimes, depending on how the behavior looks, just this particular response may not be effectively connected to a natural reinforcer. Golfing is a prime example of that. So, just if you try to verbally define a golf swing, right, what you're going to find out is that no matter how accurate you are in your description, there's no guarantee that it's going to put you in touch with a reinforcer, because there's other stuff involved that you can't verbalize. Okay. So it's going to be very difficult. You almost have to have a feel for it and things like that. There's some other stuff that happens. So providing a definition is not going to put you in contact with the natural reinforcers. You're not going to know how to connect that behavior to the natural reinforcers. It's a difficult sort of thing to do. Okay?
If we are going to define something topographically speaking, then we need to be concerned about all the response forms this behavior may take. So how can it look, and how can we need to write that down. So all the different possible ways in which this behavior can be performed. So a good example of the difference between a functional and topographical based definition is turning on the light switch. Right? So the functional based definition is the light switch is flipped due to action of an individual. Okay? And a topographical based definition would be using your hand to move the light switch into a particular position, or but you got to be able to provide all response forms. So you better be talking about doing your elbow, your shoulder, your hips, your heads, your ears, your butts, whatever. All right, as well. So topographical based definitions useful for observation, but not as useful for figuring out what's actually maintaining that behavior. So sometimes we do both. Okay, in fact, in my experience, I typically do both. What does this behavior look like, and what is its what's its function? Right? What does it seem to be getting? What effect does that behavior have on the environment? So we bounce back and forth between them, but usually get more information out of function-based definitions than you do out of topographical-based definitions. But again, each one has its purpose, and you use them at different times. What are the measurable dimensions of behavior? Right? This should pretty much be all repeat for most of us here. Repeatability is a measurable definition. In other words, frequency. Frequency is how often something occurs. Rate is how often something occurs over a period of time. So rate is frequency data combined with time. Right? Temporal extent. How long does this behavior occur? In other words, duration. Right? So temporal locus. What's its relation to other events? Again, ABC analysis, that's what we're after. So those are the types of things we can measure about behavior, right? So let's look at some more things here. Rate versus rate and frequency. Okay? Count divided by time is rate. Okay? So count is frequency divided by time gives us a rate. Okay? It's more informative, all right? than just frequency alone. All right, it's more informative than just a count alone. It gives us a rate of responding. Right, and in other words, it gives us fluency, correct and incorrect response rate. So we can look at both. Right, so fluency is defined as correct and incorrect response rate, and we look at a proportion of that and all those types of things. There's 100 different ways to calculate it, but the point is that you're always looking at a rate. So the amount of words spoken correctly per minute, and that's a rate. Okay, so that's what we're after. So whenever you can, always collect rate data versus frequency data. All right, free operands versus discrete trials. Free operands have a clear beginning and an end, okay, and can start and stop at any time. Right? But a discrete trial is controlled by an opportunity to emit a response. So a free operand, think of that as a kid asking a question in a class. For the most part, you can start and stop at any time, and there's a clear beginning and an end. Right? A discrete trial is saying, okay, now I want you to do your homework. Controlled by an opportunity to emit a response, or when the teacher calls on you. So the teacher calls on the kid, then that kid is engaging in a discrete trial. If the kid has the opportunity to raise their hand anytime they want and ask a question, that's a free operand. Okay? So I run my classes in free operand settings, and sometimes I'll use discrete trials. Acceleration, right? Change in the rate of responding over time, basically learning to read. Right? So when we think about acceleration charts, saying, okay, so this is a change in the rate, and a rate is change as well. So it's kind of an odd thing to calculate, but the idea is that you're already, so a change in the rate of change is essentially what you're after here. The rate of change, think of a rate of responding. As a kid's learning to read, they're learning to read at a particular rate. So they're adding new words every day, so on and so forth. And there's a acceleration chart for that, is what the term used to be. I don't know what's always used in school psych, but acceleration chart, a progress line or progress bar or target or whatever, a criterion, right? So, but it should be some type of slope, and it's increasing, right? So by the time they're at the end of third grade, they should be able to read X numbers of words or X level of reading or so on and so forth. Well, sometimes you get people that are behind, right? So they're off that line. We need to get them back onto that line. So we actually have to get them to improve faster, right? Essentially what we're talking about is changing a steady state. And change in itself is a steady state, right? So if I'm constantly learning one new word a day, that's a steady state. Okay? It's maintaining, so you can hear my hand kind of banging here, right? So if that's the case, I can change that steady state and get you to learn more, quicker, right? To catch you up to your peers, and then once you're caught up to your peers, I can put you back to that same rate of learning that your peers were at. You get behind again, and I'm going to have to pick up the speed a little bit. Okay, and then you're going to have to catch up to your peers and slow down once you're with your peers, right? So that's the idea of changing a steady state. So if you're at a particular rate of responding, we can change that rate of responding. We can improve it. We can slow it down. We can do all that type of stuff. So that's acceleration, and that's what we're talking about with acceleration. Duration, something else we can work with, right? Total per session, cumulative, so we can add up the total amount of time that you spend out of seat during a day, right? We can do it per occurrence. We can look at both rate and duration. So we can look at how often are you out of seat and how long are you out of seat each time. Typically used with discrete trials. You can do it with free operands, but it's typically used with discrete trials. Right? Temporal locus measures, right? Response latency. How long does it take you to respond from the time that I ask you a question? I actually did a study about this recently with regard to university students and taking tests. And I would open up the test for a particular amount of time, let's say 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks, whatever it was, and the end result was I was measuring procrastination, in other words, response latency. From the time that test was open, how long did it take for you to take the exam? Right? When we're using response latency, we're looking for inner response time. Time from the stimulus, from the tact or the mand or whatever it may be, time from that stimulus to the time that you engage in the behavior. This is directly related to rate of responding. So in other words, we use this with differential reinforcement of high rates of behavior schedules, differential reinforcement of low rates of behavior schedules, and so on and so forth. Again, we'll cover these things in more detail later. Other measures, something I've used quite a bit, trials to criterion. How often or how many times does it take you to actually achieve the criteria? And this is why my tests, when I do mastery-based teaching, my tests have five opportunities on them. Why? It was an empirical thing because here quite a while ago I did a study about giving people unlimited opportunities to take the tests, and so I just analyzed the data very clearly. I said, okay, how many times on average does it take people to get to 90% are better on an exam. And about 80 to 90% of the people were successful at getting to 90% of the exam in 5 or fewer attempts. So now you know why I give 5 opportunities on an exam to achieve mastery criteria, because most people can do it within 5. Right? Sometimes people can't, and they couldn't, but I had to choose something. I didn't want to functionally make it unlimited. Right? Other measures, how does a behavior look? Right? So think about this in terms of art. Art is almost always measured topographically. Did you color within the lines? Is it proportionate? Do you have your what do you call that term when the depth of field right, or do you have your whatever that perspective right? You know, that type of thing. So that's topography. How does it look? Size of the behavior. Is it loud? Is it not loud? Oops. Is it loud? Is it not loud? Right? So that's magnitude. So is it intense? Is it loud? Is it big? Is it small? Is it how strong is it? So all sorts of stuff there. But those are the general categories in the last several slides of how we can measure pretty much any behavior that's out there, right? And we often do measure them in this way. And sometimes you measure them in multiple ways all at the same time. Typically speaking, you measure what you need in order to change the behavior in the direction that you want to change it. All right, how do we do this observation? Well, event recording. So event recording, again, that's very straightforward. Event recording is just did it happen, did it not happen, did it happen, did it not happen, so on and so forth. Timing, how long was the behavior going for? You can record this over a long period, short period. You can do a stopwatch, start, stop, okay, because the behavior was going, and then restart. In other words, you're adding seconds to it, stop, and then restart later, and stop. And now you can get that total amount of duration that's happened during the day. You can also break this up into individual ones. Then you've got time sampling methods, right? So there's all sorts of different methods here. So we've got time sampling. We've got the whole interval procedures, right? So look at this one. If we go, okay, in the first minute, in the second minute, third minute, and fourth minute, that's our intervals that we're looking at here. So the question is, when did the behavior start? And that's the arrow is there is when the behavior starts, and it stops at the end of the arrow, right? So on the left side here, right here, woo, right here, that's where the behavior started. And right here is where the behavior ended. That's right where the behavior started, and that's right where the behavior ended. So ask yourself, okay, with the whole interval, how many whole intervals did this behavior go for? Well, maybe here, click it right. It went for those 2. Why? Because this whole interval, the behavior was continuing for that entire minute. It was also continuing for that entire minute. But notice, we ended up not capturing this at all. So basically, we are underestimating the amount behavior is happening. We said that, hey, it only happened during these periods because it went for that whole interval. Right? But if we use a partial interval approach, it's a little different. So now with the partial interval, we got all 3. It occurred at all. The behavior occurred at least once during that period, or during that interval. So now we're overestimating it, because this would assume that the behavior went for 3 total minutes. With the whole interval, with whole interval, we assume the behavior only went for 2 minutes, so we're underestimating. Here, it looks like behavior's gone for 3 minutes, but in reality, we're short 20 seconds here. Okay? So behavior did restart within that second interval, but it didn't go for the whole interval. So one overestimates, one underestimates. Partial interval is the one I've used the most. Sometimes people use whole interval. It's common, especially if it becomes a problem, for different things. It doesn't have to be 1 minute. This could be 10-minute things. And if the kid's completely off task for that entire time, that's a problem. If they're only off task for a little bit of the time, that's not too much of a problem. So it depends on the behavior that you're looking at as to when you want to do whole interval. All right, when we do our observations, after we've defined our behavior and come up with all the procedures for doing that stuff, then we need to figure out how is it reliable or is it not. So we can go through that pretty easily. So basically, we've got this particular issue right off the bat. Is what you observed true? That's essentially all there is to it. And the question, some things it's really easy. Spelling, okay, really easy to observe, right? I spelled the word correctly. I did not spell the word correctly. So there's no need to really double check that too much, right? Unless it's not a bad idea to make sure that it's been double checked, but that's a really easy one to make sure that what you're observing is actually correct, right? So yes, I spelled the behavior correctly. Well, we can double check that, right? Hitting, that gets a little harder, right? Depends on how you define hitting. because that could be defined multiple ways. So I may say you hit somebody, but in reality, we're just tapping them on the shoulder. Right? Arithmetic. Okay? Again, same type of stuff. Is it easy? Is it not easy? Are we sure you did it? Are we not sure you did it? That type of stuff. So we have to be worried about with the accuracy of our observations. So specifically speaking, it's easy with some measures, right? Like with the permanent product type stuff, that's pretty easy, right? We can go back and spot check and double check to make sure that the observations were done correctly and things like that. And we can see if a particular, we can double check the teacher by going through their records and saying, okay, did the kid actually do the assignment? And if he did, great. If not, then and you said they did, well, guess what? Okay, that can be a problem. Or vice versa, saying, well, the kid's saying they did it and you're saying they didn't, but we did a spot check and we found that the kid actually did do the homework and you just didn't record it in your grade book. Right? That's a problem. Right? So we have to worry about the accuracy of our observations. And behavior analysts, we have to worry about it in some other different ways. One of the ways in which we worry about this stuff and deal with accuracy is through multiple observers. So we take, especially if we're observing something like hitting, right, or a problem behavior in a class, we're not just going to send one person out and do the observations. We're going to get a couple of people to do those observations. That way we can increase the accuracy with which we're saying that the behavior is occurring. Right? So when we report that accuracy, we report it like this: 95% agreement on 22 of 38 assessments. So between those, we had 38 total assessments. On 22 of them, we had 95% agreement or better. Okay. On the other 16, we were well below that. Okay. So that did we do well? We did pretty good. That's not bad. Right? So we've got some room for improvement there. So let's look at reliability, because ultimately what we're going to get at here is inter-observer agreement or inter-rater reliability. So right off the bat, reliability is not equal to validity. Okay. Reliability is getting the same measure, right? Validity is measuring measuring something accurately, right? So ultimately, what we're saying here with reliability is that the observer must remeasure the same events. Okay? So how is that going to be possible? Well, I suppose it could be possible if you're recording something, but ultimately speaking, we're just going to set up with multiple observers, and we're going to have those multiple observers watch the same event. So with the observer remeasuring their own events, remeasuring one set of events, again, they're just going to code whatever it is now, go back and redo it later and see if they get the same scores at the same times. But what's typically done, though, is that you end up with multiple people watching the same kiddo or watching the same scenario and seeing if they see the same stuff at the same time. When we do it with multiple observers, we're going to be focused on inter-observer agreement. Right? So this helps us decide whether or not our observations are quality observations, right? It says ensures the quality of the observers, but it doesn't do it in itself. By assessing inter-observer agreement, it allows you to go back, modify the observer's behavior, and make them do it correctly. Right? It does detect observer drift. Right? In other words, definitions change over time. Right? Observer drift happens. Think of it if you're observing a four-way stop, right? And you start out with this really clear definition that a car must come to a complete stop. That little rock thing that happens when you finally stop your car, it kind of shakes forward a little bit after you stop completely. When that happens, then we've said the car has completely stopped. But you do this for 2, 3, 4, 5, 10 hours. Your definition may change. Or you do this a day a week for 6 months, your definition may slowly change, and you're like, oh, well, that was close enough, right? Well, when you start saying, ooh, close enough, you're starting to get inaccurate, right? Because you have to follow either that operational definition or the topographical definition or the functional definition. Using inter-observer agreement allows us to increase confidence in our definition, because if our inter-observer agreement is high, then we know that our definition is quality because everybody's seeing the same thing at the same time. Again, if we have high inter-observer agreement, it increases the confidence in our observers. Typically speaking, we never use naive observers. We train them before we put them out into the field, because observation is a skill. It's difficult, so you're going to get some practice at it. And that's why in this course I have you do practice observations. All right, here's some of the basic procedures for how we do this. Right? Total count inter-observer agreement. Oh, my box is a little buggered there. So we got two observers, Coetzee and James. Notice what we have here. Period 1, they had the same. Period 2, they had something different. Period 3, something different. Period 4, they had something similar, or they had the same thing. And at the total, Coetzee had 16, James had 17. In other words, total count inter-observer agreement, 16 divided the smallest number divided by the largest number multiplied by 100 equals 94%. Do you really believe they were 94% accurate? Look at the data. See what you think. Because, in a sense, we're going to learn another way to do this, and I'll say, no, they're only 50% accurate. Because they only got the same observations twice. Now, they're never too far off. In period 2, Coetzee saw it 7 times, James saw it 6 times, whatever the behavior was. Period 3, Coetzee saw it 4, and James saw it 6. So we might have a little bit of a definitional problem in here, but on the other hand, it's not too bad. 16 out of 17. It's kind of overinflated here. Total count tends to overinflate things because think of this. Think if I had Coetzee saw the behavior 5 times during period 1, never saw it at all after that, and James didn't see it at all until period 4, and then in period 4 he saw it 5 times. That would come out with 100% inter-observer agreement. Right? That would be wrong. Coetzee saw it 5 times during period 1, and James saw it 5 times during period 4. Nobody else saw it any other times. That's a big problem. And the total count is going to tell you that it's 100% agreement, but it's not. That's just, they didn't ever agree. Okay? So we got to worry about that. So we have some other procedures. One of those other ones is the mean count. Okay, we can do the same data here. So the inter-observer agreement, 3.53 divided by 4. Right? So where did we get that from? Right? On average, so we added everything up. So did they agree? So we took an average here. Okay. So this is 100% agreement. This is, they agreed 80%. 6 divided by 7 is 86. 4 divided by 6 is 67. All right. They agreed here, so that's 100%. 0 divided by 0. Right. So then we add all those guys up, and we got 3.53. Right. So what's the average of all those? 3.53 divided by 4 equals 88. 88%. Not too bad. That's probably a little bit more accurate than the one above. I still don't like using this one, though, because you're averaging stuff, and behavior analysts don't like to average stuff. So we've got another one we can use, exact count. Okay. In other words, how many times did they have the exact same scores? Well, they only had the exact same scores twice. Right? They had it this time, right, and they had it this time. So 2 times out of 4 total observations, 50% accuracy. Okay, so another method of calculating. Right? So this is again for the types of just we're looking at discrete type behaviors here, where we're counting how many times they've occurred. Right? We can also look at duration data. Right? So we've got 112 seconds here for Coetzee and 92 seconds for James. Right? Of what they saw this stuff. The interval inter-observer agreement we can calculate there. Again, 50 divided by 53, 94%, 16 divided by 17, 94%, so on and so forth. This is that same averaging procedure. There's 3 different things we can do here, right? So we can do total duration, 92 divided by 112, right? 82% accuracy. Mean duration, 3.5 out of 4, using that same procedure that we talked about before, 88%, and the agreement. They only agreed 1 time out of those 4 periods, so 25% agreement. So I tend to use the stuff where it's more strict. So I would focus on the agreement issue here, the agreement procedure here, but at the same time knowing that, well, maybe that isn't quite what it should be. So sometimes we do multiple ones of these. The mean, the total duration, actually, sorry, not the total duration, but the mean duration and the agreement, those 2 combined give us some pretty good information. They perfectly agreed 25% of the time. Now keep in mind, you're doing duration stuff, that's hard to get the exact number of seconds that somebody engaged in behavior, and hard to get that nailed perfectly across 2 people because you got to hit your stopwatches at the same time and all that stuff. It can be a challenge. So, but these are the standard ways in which we do inter-observer agreement. There's, the one that I think that is most often used in the field that you'll run into is right up here. Not exact count. Yeah, exact count. It's called different things in different areas. Occurrence, non-occurrence, right? So if we're doing that partial interval, whole interval stuff, we can look at did the behavior occur during this period, did it not? And we can get
look at the proportions of those occurrences versus not occurring, right?
So did we agree 100% of the time? Did we not agree 100% of the time on occurrence and non-occurrence? You use a procedure like this, but imagine it was X's like on that a couple slides ago. We have two people observing those X's. Did they agree when those X's happened? Did they not agree when those X's happened? So that's pretty much that. There's more to this in your book. There's more discussion of some of this stuff. So of course, as always, read that. And I will talk to you again soon for another lecture. Take care.